the early morning hours of June 5, 1967, Israeli warplanes streaked across the Mediterranean sky. Their mission, a surprise attack that would change the map of the Middle East forever. In just 6 days, Israel would defeat 3 Arab armies, triple its territory, and fundamentally alter the course of history in the region. This is the story of the Six-Day War, a conflict whose aftershocks continue to shape our world today. To understand the Six-Day War, we must first understand its roots, which stretch back to the early 20th century. After World War I, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire left the future of Palestine uncertain, as European Jews, fleeing persecution, sought a homeland in their ancestral territory. Tensions grew with the local Arab population. The United Nations 1947 partition plan divided the territory between Jews and Arabs, a compromise that led to the declaration of the State of Israel in May 1948. Immediately, 5 Arab nations invaded, but the new state survived what Israelis call their War of Independence and Palestinians remember as Ol Nakba, the catastrophe. When the fighting stopped in 1949, armistice lines were drawn that left Israel with more territory than the UN had originally allocated. Jordan controlled the West Bank and East Jerusalem, Egypt held the Gaza Strip, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians became refugees. These armistice lines, not formal borders, would become the flashpoints of future conflicts. For the next 18 years, Israel's neighbors refused to recognize its existence. Border skirmishes were common, particularly with Syria in the north, where artillery batteries positioned on the Golan Heights could shell Israeli communities below. Palestinian Fedayeen fighters, supported by Egypt, launched cross-border raids, and Israel responded with retaliatory strikes. By 1967, the Palestinian question remained unresolved. Refugees in Egyptian-controlled Gaza and the Jordanian-held West Bank lived in the hope that Arab armies would someday destroy Israel and allow their return. Meanwhile, Israel, though militarily stronger after its 1956 collaboration with Britain and France during the Suez Crisis, remained geographically vulnerable. At points only 9 miles wide. In the mid-1960s, Cold War politics intensified regional rivalries. The Soviet Union armed Egypt and Syria, while the United States increasingly supported Israel. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser sought to position himself as the leader of a pan-Arab movement that would unite the fragmented Arab world. Nasser was caught in a difficult position. To maintain his standing as the leader of Arab nationalism, he needed to appear strong against Israel, but Egypt was also embroiled in a costly war in Yemen that drained military resources, balancing act that would soon collapse. In April 1967, Israeli and Syrian forces clashed in an aerial dogfight that ended with Israeli jets shooting down 6 Syrian MiGs and flying provocatively over Damascus. The escalation worried Soviet leaders, who fed false intelligence to Egypt claiming that Israel was massing troops for an invasion of Syria. On May 14th, responding to this Soviet warning, Nasser ordered Egyptian troops into the Sinai Peninsula. 4 days later, he demanded the withdrawal of the United Nations Emergency Force, peacekeepers who had been stationed on the Egyptian-Israeli border since the 1956 Suez Crisis. UN Secretary General U Thant complied without consulting the Security Council. The buffer between Israeli and Egyptian forces had vanished overnight. When we saw the UN leaving, we knew something serious was coming. Our intelligence reports showed Egyptian divisions moving into Sinai. Every day brought more alarming news. On May 22nd, Nasser took the step that made war virtually inevitable. He announced the closure of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, cutting off Israel's access to the Red Sea and its vital supply routes to Asia and East Africa. For Israel, this blockade constituted an act of war. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol declared, "The blockade is a gross interference in the rights of all nations to free passage in international waters. Israel will not stand idly by." Meanwhile, Radio Cairo broadcast inflammatory rhetoric. The Arab people are prepared for the battle of total liberation. It is Arab destiny to destroy Israel and reclaim Palestine. As Arab forces mobilized on Israel's borders, fear gripped the Israeli population. Public parks were converted into mass grave sites in preparation for heavy casualties. The Israeli economy ground to a halt as reserves were called up, representing nearly 20% of the workforce. Wu feared another Holocaust. "The Arab armies surrounding us outnumbered us in tanks, planes, and troops. We knew if we lost this war, there would be no Israel anymore." As diplomatic efforts stalled, Israel faced a terrible choice: strike first or risk annihilation. On June 4th, day after weeks of debate, the Israeli War Cabinet voted for preemptive action. Dawn broke on June 5, 1967. At Israeli air bases, pilots had been briefed on a daring plan codenamed Operation Focus. Years in the making, it aimed to destroy the Egyptian Air Force on the ground before it could even take off. At 7:45 a.m., nearly 200 Israeli aircraft, almost the entire Air Force, took off from bases across Israel, flying low to avoid radar detection. They maintained strict radio silence as they headed toward Egypt. We flew barely 30 meters above the Mediterranean. Our training was so precise that each pilot knew exactly which Egyptian airfield to attack and which aircraft to target. Even the timing was calculated to catch Egyptian pilots at breakfast. In a stroke of luck for Israel, Egyptian Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amer was scheduled to inspect airbases that morning. To avoid any incidents, Egyptian anti-aircraft batteries had been ordered not to fire without explicit authorization. The Israeli planes struck with devastating precision. In less than 2 hours, they destroyed over 300 Egyptian aircraft, most while still on the runways. Similar strikes against Syrian, Jordanian, and Iraqi air bases followed. By noon, Israel had established complete air superiority over the battlefield. It was like a scene from hell. Planes burning everywhere, runways cratered, and no way to respond. In those first hours, we lost our eyes and our shield. From that moment, we were fighting blind. With Arab air forces effectively eliminated, Israeli ground forces launched their offensive. 3 armored divisions pushed into the Sinai Desert, bypassing Egyptian strongholds to maintain momentum. Israeli tanks raced across the sand toward the Suez Canal, while infantry engaged Egyptian forces now exposed to air attacks. Meanwhile, despite Israeli pleas for neutrality, Jordan's King Hassan, bound by a defense pact with Egypt and pressured by his population, ordered artillery strikes on Israeli positions. Israeli forces responded by moving into the West Bank. The battle for Jerusalem began as paratroopers fought house to house through the city's outskirts. After fierce fighting at Ammunition Hill, where 36 Israelis and 71 Jordanians died, Israeli forces pushed toward the Old City. By the end of the first day, Israel had shattered Egypt's frontline defenses. Egyptian forces began a disorganized retreat back toward the Suez Canal, abandoning equipment and positions. Field Marshal Amer ordered a full withdrawal from Sinai, but poor communication turned what might have been an orderly retreat into chaos. Israeli aircraft pounded Egyptian columns caught in the open desert. We were told to withdraw, but no one told us how or where to go. Vehicles jammed the roads. Israeli jets came again and again. What began as a military maneuver became a nightmare. In Jerusalem, fighting intensified on June 7th. Israeli paratroopers breached the old city walls and advanced toward the Western Wall, Judaism's holiest site from which Jews had been barred since 1948. The Temple Mount is in our hands. This moment became one of the most emotional in Israeli history. Soldiers wept openly as they touched the ancient stones. For many Israelis, the reunification of Jerusalem represented the fulfillment of a 2,000-year dream. But the war continued. In the north, Syrian artillery on the Golan Heights had been shelling Israeli settlements in Galilee. With the Egyptian and Jordanian fronts stabilized, Israel turned its attention to this long-standing threat. The Golan Heights presented a formidable challenge: steep terrain, fortified bunkers, and extensive minefields. Syrian defenses, built over years, were designed to be impenetrable. We faced a wall of fire climbing those heights. Syrian gunners had sighted every approach. Our tanks had to zigzag up narrow roads while under constant fire from above. Despite heavy losses, Israeli forces breached the Syrian defenses. By June 9th, they had captured the strategic plateau and were advancing toward Damascus. Fearing the fall of their capital, Syrian leaders agreed to a ceasefire on June 10th. When the guns fell silent on June 10th, the map of the Middle East had been dramatically redrawn. Israel now controlled the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, territories 3 times the size of its pre-war area. The human cost was severe. Israel lost around 800 soldiers, while Arab casualties numbered in the thousands. Approximately 250,000 Palestinians and Syrians fled or were displaced from their homes in the West Bank and Golan Heights. In Israel, the victory inspired a wave of euphoria and national pride. Many saw the swift triumph as divine intervention, a modern miracle that secured the Jewish state's survival. Defense Minister Dayan declared, "We have returned to our holiest places, never depart from them again." The 6-day war transformed Israel's self-perception from that of a vulnerable David to a regional Goliath. It created a sense of invincibility that would influence Israeli military thinking for generations. For the Arab world, the defeat was devastating, what they termed al-Naqsa, or the setback. Egypt's Nasser offered his resignation, though popular demonstrations persuaded him to remain in office. The Arab League issued its famous 3 no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. The war's outcome fundamentally altered Palestinian national consciousness. With the West Bank and Gaza under Israeli occupation, Palestinians increasingly realized they would need to take their struggle for self-determination into their own hands rather than relying on Arab states. The international response reflected Cold War dynamics. The Soviet Union severed diplomatic relations with Israel and increased military support to Arab states. The United States, initially neutral, it grew closer to Israel, seeing it as a strategic regional ally against Soviet influence. On November 22, 1967, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 242, calling for withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict, and the termination of all claims or states of belligerency. The deliberately ambiguous wording, whether Israel should withdraw from the territories or just territories, would fuel decades of diplomatic disputes. More than half a century later, the Six-Day War's consequences continue to shape the Middle East. The territories captured by Israel remain at the center of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The war created what some call the impossible trilemma: Israel can be Jewish, democratic, and hold all the territories it captured, but only 2 of these 3 goals can be achieved simultaneously. Generations of Palestinians have now lived their entire lives under occupation, with no political rights and limited control over their daily lives. The Six-Day War didn't end in 1967. For us, it continues. The war's aftermath saw the rise of religious nationalism in Israel, with some viewing the territorial gains as divine fulfillment of biblical promises. Settlement construction began in the occupied territories, creating what would become one of the most contentious issues in peace negotiations. For Egypt and Jordan, the path eventually led to peace treaties with Israel, Egypt in 1979 and Jordan in 1994. Both agreements included territorial concessions, with Israel returning the Sinai to Egypt while maintaining control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Syria and Israel remained technically at war, with the Golan Heights, formerly annexed by Israel in 1981, still a point of contention. Meanwhile, the Palestinian quest for statehood continues, shaped by the territorial realities created in those 6 days in June. The Six-Day War represents one of history's most consequential short conflicts. In less than a week, it transformed a regional dispute into an international flashpoint and created problems that diplomats, politicians, and peacemakers are still struggling to solve today. The war also demonstrated how quickly conflict can escalate in this volatile region, a lesson that remains relevant as tensions periodically flare. It showed how miscalculation, misinformation, and the pressure of public opinion can push nations toward confrontation, even when their leaders may not desire war. As we reflect on those 6 dramatic days in 1967, we're reminded that history is not just about the past, but about the present and future it creates. The territorial, political, and psychological changes wrought by the Six-Day War continue to influence everything from border security to religious claims, from water rights to national identity. The lines drawn by tanks and planes in those 6 days of June remain, in many ways, the lines that define the challenges of peace and coexistence in the Middle East today.